What's up guys, thanks for tuning in. Today we're doing a complete suspension upgrade and overhaul on the Grand Design 28BH, so stay tuned. So a couple of years ago, if you follow my channel, you may have seen that I did a leaf spring replacement on our Grand Design 28BH. That's been a few years ago now. Back when I did that, it was kind of when there was a lot of COVID shortages. It was hard to get my hands on parts in any kind of a timely manner. We didn't have a whole lot of time in between trips, so I just replaced the leaf springs. I ended up having to reuse the U-bolts, which is not really recommended. I reused the wet bolts. The only thing I actually replaced was the leaf springs. I got some comments on that video with some people recommending upgrading to the bronze leaf spring bushings. The leaf springs that I used back then just had the nylon bushings in them. Well, those have failed. So this project was going to just be a bushing replacement, but once I started getting under there and looking at the springs that I used back then, I realized that they're starting to flatten out a little bit. It wasn't really the springs I wanted to go with anyway. So I started looking at the MORRyde CRE 3000, the new Equalizer, to replace the Equalizer that's on there. And then by the time I'm gonna have everything apart to do that, I'm like, well, I might as well just go ahead and do the springs. I got 3,500 pound 6-leaf springs to replace the 4-leaf leaf springs that are currently on there. And then at the same time, I'm going to go ahead, I ordered the MORRyde new wet bolts, bushings, and the heavy duty shackle kit. These things are super heavy duty compared to the flimsy shackles that are on there now. So we're replacing the shackles, the Equalizer, and we're going to go with a 6-leaf 3,500 pound spring that actually came with new U-bolts. So these are longer than the standard U-bolts that are on there now, so they'll be long enough to reach through. The reason I didn't upgrade to a 5 or 6 leaf leaf spring last time was I couldn't get my hands on long enough U-bolts in the time that I had to work with. So kind of got started early gathering all our parts, so we have everything we need, and we're going to get started. I'm going to repack the bearings as well while I have everything apart. So I've got a video on how to repack those bearings. I'll leave a link to it in the description if you want to check that out. But got a pretty good day of work ahead of us, so I'm going to get started. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is get the fifth wheel raised up. A lot of different ways that you can jack the fifth wheel up. What I have done in the past, and it's worked out really well, I haven't had any problems with it, is I'll use the leveling system to raise the fifth wheel up to get a lot of the weight off the springs. The tires are still going to be just touching the ground, but the majority of the weight is going to be raised up off the axles. And then I can just use a small bottle jack and then a little small floor jack just to get the tire up that extra little bit to be able to get the tires off. And that's worked out really well for me. All right, so I've got it jacked up. With all the weight being mostly supported by the leveling jacks, you don't really have to put a lot of pressure on the axle just to raise that tire up just a little bit. So you're not going to damage the axle at all doing it this way. Like I said, I've done this now. This is probably the 4th time that I've jacked it up like this, and I've had no issues. So now we're going to rip these tires off. Last time I did this, I did it all by hand with ratchets. This time I've got a cordless impact, so I'm hoping that's going to help speed this process up. So this is what kind of started giving me an indicator I had something going on with the suspension. You can see this tire good on the outside, lot of wear on the inside. So when we got to a campsite, one that we were just at recently, after the trailer was leveled, the site was a little bit uneven, so it picked up a lot of weight off the right side of the trailer. And I noticed that I could move the tire back and forth. So that was obviously not correct. And once I started looking, that's when I found out that the bushings were worn out. So we also have a brand new set of Salem tires that we're going to put on here. So when this is all done, we should be good for quite a while. So this is really pretty straightforward. I mean, we're replacing the shackles, we're replacing the equalizer, and we're replacing the springs, U-bolts. So really, we're not reusing any of this. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the leaf spring bolts. So I'm going to take these out. I'm going to take the U-bolts off, get this spring out of the way. I'm going to do the same thing on the front, get the spring off and out of the way. Then we'll take this center bolt out to get the equalizer off, and then we'll just go in reverse, put everything all back together. Shouldn't be real difficult, but it is going to be a little bit time consuming. These nuts are 11/16 and 3/4. These nuts on top for your U-bolts are 3/4. So let's take it apart. We've got the axle supported by our little jack down here, just to kind of keep it from dropping down once we take everything apart. Alright, so we're going to use our, just put a big crescent wrench back here just to hold these wet bolts. You can see they're spinning. They're not really supposed to do that, so they're stripped out in the shackle. So this one's wanting to fall out already. It's pushing out. So I'll just put the nut back on here so I can tap the back one out. There's wet bolt number 1 out. There we go. And now that one's out. Drop that whole thing down. Gotta be careful because these are tight, so you don't want to rip your brake wires. So all right, there's that. One spring. So these have been on there for right about 2 years. I did grease the wet bolts, but those nylon bushings just are not sturdy enough. Even greasing the bolts, they just don't hold up. So you can see they've still got a pretty good bend in them, pretty good arch. So they weren't flattened out totally, but I just figured if I had to get them out to change the bushings, I might as well just replace them. So now we're going to do the same thing on the front. We're just going to pull the shackle bolt, and then we're going to pull the front bolt. That one came out nice and easy. That nut is 7/8. That's a 7/8 nut. So. Right, so got that bad boy out. There's our stock equalizer. All right, so now everything is disassembled. We got to go around and put our bronze bushings into the new leaf springs, get rid of those nylon bushings that are in there, and then we'll bring it over here, put it all back together. So the way we're going to get the nylon bushings out and the new bronze bushings in, you can pretty much just use, all I'm using is my little pry bar, and I'm just kind of getting in there and knocking these out. I mean, you can see these things are, I mean, there's nothing to these. They just fold right up, split. So we're going to use a C-clamp to press our new ones in place. You don't want to use a hammer and start beating on these because you'll damage the end of it. I found that out. I thought I could tap them in. I tapped the first one in on the one spring and it went in. It was pretty snug, but it went in okay. And when I tried to do the next one, tapping it in, it got really tight and gave it a little extra whack, and it split the bushing. So luckily, since the MORRyde CR3000 equalizer already has bushings in it, I have some extra bushings, thank goodness. So we're going to use a C-clamp and just press them right in. All right, so I'm using one of the shackle bolts that I removed. I took the grease zerk out of it. I'm going to insert it into the new bronze bushing. You're not going to want to put any grease on the outside. You want these to fit in there tight. I greased the bolt so it'll come back out, because once it's in there, this bolt's going to be really tight to get out. So I'm going to put it in position and grab our C-clamp. I'm going to use a socket over the bottom. This is not the world's greatest C-clamp, so I've kind of got to hold this so it doesn't spin and try to walk off, but then you're just going to twist it. Pipe on there, give me a little extra leverage. And you're just going to press it right down into the spring. Right, and it's in. So now we just got to get this bolt out. There we go. All right, so we got the new bushings pressed in. C-clamp, 100% the way to go. These things just popped right out. These are a little harder to press in. There's definitely a knack to figuring out how to press them in. You know, getting them lined up nice and straight, and then using that bolt from the old shackle really helped press them in a lot easier, and we didn't damage any of them. It was a piece of cake using that C-clamp. You probably will if you don't have a vise that you're putting your spring in. If I had a shop that I was doing this, I would have this spring clamped in a vise and I would be pressing those bushings in that way, but I didn't. So if you have an extra set of hands that can hold onto the spring for you while you're twisting that clamp to push them in, it's going to make your life a lot easier. So I mentioned we were replacing the shackles. Here's just a little example of the difference between the stock shackle and then these MORRyde shackles. I mean, you can see that's a that is heavy duty. That is a heavy duty upgrade, and I'm really glad that I went with these. When you order these, you're going to need to measure your hole spacing center to center. There's a couple different options, and the same thing when you're ordering your equalizer. There are two different options, and your way you're going to measure it is you're going to measure from the center of each wheel, center to center on your wheels to get your wheelbase, and that's going to determine which one you need. All right, now we're just going to go get it all put back together. All right, so now we're going to put our new equalizer in place using the new wet bolt. So when you put the wet bolt in, you're going to see the grease hole. You're going to want to make sure that hole is to the side, not on top or bottom, because if it's on top or on bottom, it's not going to want to let the grease shoot through. So to make it be able to put grease in through your zerk fitting, you're going to make sure that bolt is to that hole, is to the side, either front or back, it won't matter. So we're going to put a little grease on this bolt to start with. And once we get everything together, we'll go through and grease everything really good. So we're going to hold the bolt on the back side so it doesn't spin, because it does have a shoulder on it, a spline shoulder. So we want that to seat into the hanger. So we're going to hold that and we're going to tighten this on the front. Tighten her up. All right, so I tightened it down. I used my impact to run it in to where the splines were seated into the spring hanger. And then I backed it off a little bit and then retightened it and torqued it down to 65 foot-pounds. So you can see we're good. So when I'm putting these springs on, I'm gonna put our clip facing toward the front. It shouldn't really matter which way that clip is facing. I've read that you can put it on either way, but a lot of people recommend putting this toward the front. That's typically how most trailers leaf springs are going to be when they're installed at the factory. All right, so now we've got our rear spring lined up. We have our bolt, our wet bolt in. I went ahead and tightened that down enough to where the splines seated into the spring hanger. And now you can see what I ended up doing was taking the U-bolts back off of the leaf spring. I had to move that around quite a bit because these wet bolts are so snug and so tight to get through there. I really had to move the spring around more to get that bolt through. So I went ahead and took the U-bolts back off. So we're going to hang our spring on here on the back first, and then put our shackles on, and then we'll line up and get it seated back where it needs to be. It's really close now, but it's going to be easier to get all these shackles and everything on there, I think, without those U-bolts in there just yet. So I went ahead and greased our shackles. We'll put them in. So these are already pressed in to the inner shackle, so you won't have to do anything with this except grease those up and push them through your bushings. And they are tight, so the way I'm getting them through is I'm taking a socket on the back so I don't damage the grease fitting, and just kind of tapping them. There we go. So we're through on the back. We'll take our front hanger, shackle, and we'll put him on the front. And then we'll put our nuts on there and pull everything tight. So same thing, we're going to hold this on the back just to make sure that it doesn't spin. And then we're going to go back and torque everything once we're done. These should be torqued it says 45 to 55 pounds, so I'm going to torque them to 50 pounds. Nice. All right. Looking better already. Now we're going to line up our spring on the spring perch there. All right, so I loosened my shackles back up so that I could have a little bit of play on my spring to get it back on the seat. So now that it's seated, I'll be able to put the leaf spring bracket on, and then we can tighten the shackles back up. All right, so we got everything torqued now. All our hangers are torqued. I'm gonna torque our U-bolts to 70 foot-pounds. It recommends 65 to 75, so I'm gonna go 70 foot-pounds on those. Torque these all to 50. So we're gonna do the same thing on the front axle, putting that front spring back in. Just gonna basically repeat this whole process up there. All right, so we got done with the other side. We came around over on the right side of the trailer. This side went super smooth. Something that made it easier for me to get everything lined up was I put the shackle bolt in the back first before I attached the leaf spring to the axle, and that gave me enough movement to kind of move it around to get everything lined up. And then once everything was in, before I tightened everything up, I was able to get the leaf spring down on the axle in place, get the U-bolts in, and just kind of get everything hand tight and fitted where it needed to be. And then I went back and tightened everything down and torqued everything down to specs. So definitely a time-consuming job. It's not easy. Having to press those bushings out made it a little more difficult, but I think it's going to be well worth it in the end. And can't wait to get this thing on the road, see how it handles. MORRyde CRE 3000. If you're thinking about putting it on, I hope this video helps you out. If you have any questions on it, feel free to ask. We always try to answer any of our questions down in the comments. So if you have any questions, go ahead and hit us up. We appreciate you guys watching, and we'll catch you guys down the road.